The Jenkins family looked impeccable from the outside. Robert, a respected businessman, was always on the radar. Charity work, social events, even occasional visits to local cafes turned into mini-events. He worked hard and was rarely seen at home for more than a few hours at a time. His wife, Andrea, was considered by everyone who knew her to be the epitome of beauty and prosperity. She possessed that rare combination of youth and maturity that allowed her to look younger than her years and still maintain her sophistication. Everything changed when Michael returned home after several years of study in another state. He had turned 24, and it was as if he had grown anew, not only in Andrea's eyes but also in his own mind. He was nothing like the skinny teenager she remembered. A grown man with a slight unshaven complexion, close-cropped curls, and a subtle grin on his lips. Michael seemed like a man who could easily manipulate others, but there was still a certain insecurity in his gaze, hidden behind the mocking expression on his face. Andrea tried not to show how shocked she was by his return. In the back of her mind, she didn't even understand why her heart had beaten faster when he had entered the house. At first, she attributed it to the joy of a family reunion, but she quickly realized it was more than that. "You look great, Michael," she said with a slight smile, eyeing him appraisingly. Perhaps even too great for someone who just graduated from university. "Funny," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "And you haven't changed at all. Well, maybe just a little prettier." Andrea couldn't find anything to reply and just laughed to hide her embarrassment. This light exchange of pleasantries was the first of many such moments where something more than mutual understanding was beginning to slip between them. Robert, however, didn't notice it. Too busy with his own affairs, he did not pay attention to the slightest nuances in the behavior of his wife and son. To him, Michael was just a son who had come home to start a new chapter in his life. Robert had no idea that during all this time their family had become something like a show, where one actor plays several roles at once. When Lauren Maxwell came over to celebrate Michael's return, she quickly picked up on the tension in the air. It was as if Andrea was constantly watching Michael's every move, as if expecting something unusual from him. Lauren couldn't figure out exactly what it was that had caught her attention so much, but there was definitely something wrong. "You know, I think Michael has grown into a real handsome man," she turned to Andrea when they were alone in the kitchen while the men discussed the news in the living room. "Well, yes," Andrea replied, averting her gaze and pretending to be busy making coffee. "Like any other young man his age." "Oh, come on," Lauren grinned, squinting her eyes slightly. "You can see the way he looks at you." Andrea turned around abruptly, something resembling consternation flashing in her gaze. "Lauren, what are you talking about?" "Oh, come on, don't pretend," the woman replied with a smile. "I'm just kidding." But there was a note of something more than just a friendly undertone in Lauren's voice. She was really picking up on something that usually stays out of sight. Andrea felt uncomfortable and hurried to change the subject, but Lauren's sly eyes were still watching her with suspicion. Over the next few days, Michael and Andrea found themselves alone together more and more often. At first it had been casual encounters in the kitchen, in the garden, or in the hall, but soon it seemed almost deliberate. It was as if they were looking for each other in empty rooms, and these moments of closeness were filled with a quiet tension that required no words. Once, when Michael accidentally touched her hand while handing her a glass, Andrea felt a slight tingling in her fingertips and involuntarily jerked her hand away. He noticed her reaction, but said nothing. Robert continued to immerse himself in his own affairs, leaving the house in Andrea's care. He was gone longer than usual, and he began to appear less and less often, even at family dinners. On one of these rare evenings together, Andrea felt her heart flutter every time she caught a glimpse of Michael sitting across from her. Robert, too engrossed in discussing the latest business news, didn't notice the silent drama unfolding between his wife and son. There came a moment when Andrea realized that her attraction to Michael was becoming all too apparent. It happened on an evening when Robert left again for a few days on business, and Michael was left home alone. Andrea decided to use this time to finally have an honest talk with Michael, to sort out her feelings and perhaps put an end to the mounting tension. However, when she entered his room, her intention changed abruptly. Meeting her gaze, Michael looked just as confused as she did. "Why did you come?" His voice sounded muffled as if from far away. "Just wanted to see how you were doing," she replied quietly, though she knew the phrase sounded ridiculous. Silence hung in the room. Andrea realized she was standing too close to him and that it was inappropriate. But it was almost impossible to take a step back. He slowly moved toward her, and she felt his warm breath on her cheek. Nothing was said, but both realized that the silence spoke for them. Suddenly, Michael broke the moment, taking a step back. "You have to leave," he said hoarsely. His words were firm, but something else read in his eyes. Andrea didn't insist, even though she felt that there had been an irreversible shift between them. Now she was sure that Michael felt the same way about her, but still wasn't ready to admit it. She left the room without a word and closed the door behind her, feeling her body fill with a mixture of anger and passion. The next day, Lauren stopped by for coffee again and happened to see Michael walking away into the garden and Andrea standing at the window, seeing him off with a look. "You know," Lauren said, breaking the silence, "you're looking at him like it's your favorite show on Netflix." Andrea turned around abruptly, trying to hide her confusion behind a smile. "You and your stupid jokes again," Lauren laughed. "Yes, I'm always with them, but you just confirmed my suspicions." "And what are you going to do about it?" Andrea asked, trying to put an indifferent tone to her voice. "Nothing. I'll just keep an eye on the plot," Lauren replied with a smirk. Andrea felt her heart beat twice as fast. Andrea felt as if time had slowed down. Since that evening when she and Michael had come face to face in his room, something had changed irreversibly. Their relationship was no longer just a set of tense glances and casual touches. There was now something more hovering between them than could be put into words. Michael was confused. He could no longer deny that he was drawn to Andrea with an inexplicable force. Memories of her touch, the smell of her perfume, and a gaze full of mystery haunted him even in his dreams. He tried to avoid long conversations, joking away when she tried to make conversation, but it was useless. Every day it became harder and harder to resist. It was a hot June evening when Robert was late for work as usual. Michael was sitting on the back porch, enjoying the coolness when Andrea came out to join him. She was wearing a light strapless dress that tightly encased her figure, emphasizing her flowing lines. Her hair was disheveled by the wind and a slight smile played on her lips. "I thought you'd gone to a friend's house," she said, taking a seat next to her. Her voice sounded soft, almost a whisper. "I didn't. Decided to stay home. Sometimes you have to rest," Michael replied, not looking at her. They sat in silence as night enveloped their garden. Michael could feel Andrea's proximity making him tense and tried to hide it behind a neutral expression. "Andrea," he began, but immediately hesitated, not knowing what to say. "Yes?" Her voice sounded almost defiant. Something in him broke at that moment. He turned to her abruptly, and before he had time to think about his actions, he grabbed her hand and pulled her to him. She didn't resist. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, and Andrea responded with a strength she had long held back. It wasn't just a kiss, it was the realization that they had long ago crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. They were in the bedroom almost unconsciously, as if they were guided by the same wave. Andrea's dress slid smoothly to the floor, and Michael ran his fingers down her naked back, feeling her shivering. They were lost in a whirlwind of passion, forgetting everything in the world, even the fact that the house was seemingly empty and Robert could return at any moment. After that evening, Michael and Andrea's relationship changed completely. Now they met whenever they had the chance. In the car when Robert was in meetings, or in secluded corners of the garden where no one could see them. They seemed to defy everything and everyone, blinded by their own obsession. But at the same time, Michael felt a sense of guilt. He saw Andrea becoming more and more restless every day, as if she were under an obsession. Her smile had been hidden behind a mask of restraint, but now she showed her feelings openly, sometimes too openly. This could not go unnoticed. Robert began to suspect that something was wrong in the family. He noticed his wife becoming more distracted and his son becoming more nervous. At one of the family parties, he asked Michael why he so rarely spent time with friends, to which Michael only shrugged his shoulders uncertainly, dismissing the answer. One night, Robert told Andrea that they should spend more time together. "We've gotten kind of distant from each other, don't you think?" he remarked with a slight reproach in his voice. Andrea froze for a moment, as if she had been caught off guard. But then she quickly found something to say. "You've always been busy working, Robert. I've gotten used to spending time alone." The words sounded a little cold, but Robert took them as a rebuke for his busyness and promised that he would try to spend more time at home. Michael, having overheard this conversation by chance, felt something painfully tighten in his chest. He knew things were getting out of control, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. The next day, Lauren came to visit again. She seemed more perceptive than ever. "Michael, you've been kind of lost lately," she said when they met in the lobby. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "Are you sure? Because I think you look like you're at war with yourself," she remarked with a shadow of a smile. Michael sighed, not knowing how to respond to her words. Lauren looked at him as if she knew more than she was showing. His insides were boiling, but he suppressed the feeling without letting himself snap. Meanwhile, Andrea was becoming more and more obsessive. Her actions were no longer mere displays of affection, they were becoming obsessions. She wrote to Michael in the middle of the night, left him notes with ambiguous messages, and demanded his attention even when he was clearly not ready for it. One night, when he was already asleep, Andrea came to his room. She leaned over and kissed his neck, waking him up. "What are you doing?" he asked, waking up and pulling away. "You know what I want, Michael, and you want it too." Her voice sounded low, almost a whisper. Michael hesitated. He felt that they had gone too far, that their connection had become something forbidden and dangerous. But he couldn't push her away. It ended with another passionate date in his room, which only strengthened Andrea's obsession and confused Michael even more. Robert began to notice the changes more and more often. One day he saw Andrea leaving Michael's room when it seemed she should have been somewhere else. There was a slight look of surprise on his face, but he didn't ask anything. Perhaps he wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. Nevertheless, the tension in the house was rising. Lauren, who continued to visit the family, began to notice more and more details. She noticed the way Andrea sometimes looked at Michael, as if the two were bound by some unknown secret, and she didn't like it at all. One day she approached Michael as he stood in the garden, staring at one point. "You know, I'm not blind," she said suddenly. "I can see that something is going on between you two." "You're exaggerating." Michael tried to brush it off, but Lauren didn't let him continue. "You're playing with fire, and somehow I think that fire is going to burn you first." Michael only shrugged, as if he didn't give her words any meaning. But inside, he could feel the anxiety rising, engulfing him headlong. The situation in the Jenkins house was becoming more and more tense, as if the air here was saturated with electricity. Robert kept finding excuses to stay late at work, or go away for the weekend without giving Andrea a reason for his absence. She, for her part, was becoming more and more absorbed in her own thoughts and in her relationship with Michael, which had now devolved into something unmanageable and destructive. Michael felt like he was trapped. Every time he tried to walk away from Andrea, or at least reduce the number of times they saw each other, she found a way to pull him back into this complicated and confusing relationship. In her eyes, he saw not just desire, but fear of losing him. It frightened Michael because each time her obsession became more and more apparent, it seemed to him that she would do anything to keep him close. One night, when Robert was away on business again, Michael and Andrea were alone together. She tried to lure him into her bedroom, but he refused. His patience was wearing thin, and this time he was determined. He packed his things and said he was going away to a friend's house for a few days to sort himself out. "You can't just pick up and leave!" Andrea almost shouted. She stood at the door to his room, blocking the exit, and her eyes burned with anger and despair. "I need space, Andrea. This has all gone too far." Michael tried to remain calm, though his voice betrayed nervousness. "Are you afraid Robert will find out? Or are you afraid of your own feelings?" Andrea stepped closer, her face full of determination. "You can't just run away. We're too far gone." "Yes, too far," he agreed, barely restraining himself from snapping. and I don't need this anymore." Her face contorted with rage. "You can't just leave me like this!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. Her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't budge. Michael pulled away sharply, trying to push her away. He felt his inner conflict growing, between the desire to get away from her and the fear of doing something he would regret later. But in a flash of passion and anger, Andrea pushed him harder than he expected. Michael lost his balance, stumbled, and stepped back. He didn't even realize he was on the stairs. Everything happened too fast, one awkward step, and his body flew down, hitting the stairs. His ears rumbled and shadows flashed before his eyes until he reached the bottom landing, where his head hit the floor with a thud. Andrea froze in place, staring down at his motionless body. Her heart was racing, her breathing hitched, and her mind whirled with thoughts. She couldn't believe it had really happened. His voice still echoed in her mind, as if he was there, and it was all just an illusion. It was a few seconds before she could make a single movement. Slowly making her way down the stairs, Andrea approached Michael on her knees. She touched his shoulder, but he didn't react. His eyes were closed, and his face, once full of life, was now gray and lifeless. She had barely had time to realize he was dead when there was the sound of the front door opening. Robert was back sooner than she expected. "Andrea?" he called out, not immediately noticing her and Michael lying on the floor. Andrea rose quickly and took a few steps toward the kitchen, trying to hide her confusion. Her brain was working at maximum capacity, searching for a way to explain what had happened. What happened here? Robert finally saw Michael and rushed over to him. He knelt down, grabbing his son's hand as if hoping to rouse him. "Michael?" Andrea, trying to stay calm, said, He fell down the stairs. It was so fast I didn't have time to do anything." Robert didn't ask any questions. He called an ambulance in a panic, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The paramedics shook their heads regretfully and began the formal procedures. Andrea stood aside, as if out of this reality, watching the tragedy unfolding before her. The next few hours passed like a blur. Andrea tried to support Robert, who was in a state of deep shock. He said nothing, and his face was like a frozen mask. At one point, she tried to touch him, but he gently but firmly removed her hand. It became clear to her that their relationship was going to change forever. Everything looked like an accident, but in her heart, Andrea knew it wasn't. She felt like she was in a vice, grief and guilt on one side, and the need to hide the truth on the other. What had happened was her secret, and she wasn't going to let anyone find out what had really happened on those stairs. Michael's funeral was attended by Lauren, who, despite her sadness, couldn't escape the feeling that there was something untold in the story. She remembered how Michael had looked in the last few days, tense, as if fighting something inside. Lauren watched Andrea and Robert discreetly, her eyes searching for any sign that might shed light on what had happened. And while everything outwardly pointed to a tragic accident, there was one small nuance that kept Lauren on her toes, the look in Andrea's eyes as she stood by the coffin. There was more to that look than just grief or loss. It was the look of someone who knew far more than she was saying. The investigation into Michael Jenkins' death began without delay. Although the official version sounded like an accident, Detective Jackson knew that such cases were rarely as simple as they appeared at first glance. He was an experienced detective, and his partner, the young and ambitious Williams, tried to keep up. They arrived on the scene to further investigate the house, talk to the family, and gather as much information as they could about the events of that ill-fated evening. The house looked peaceful and serene, which didn't fit with the tragedy that had happened there. Jackson ran his hand along the staircase railing, which he said should have left marks if someone had actually tried to hold on. A careful look didn't pick up any obvious signs of a struggle, but it seemed to the detective that it wasn't that simple. "What do you think?" Williams asked, following his partner who was scrutinizing each step. "So far, I think it looks like a neat pitch for a lazy cop. Fall, head bump, accidental death. But, I'm not like that." Jackson grinned and headed over to Robert, who was sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The first interrogation passed without much revelation. Robert was devastated. His answers sounded curt, but there was no guilt in them. He kept repeating the same thing. Michael often went up and down the stairs. Maybe he just stumbled. Andrea, on the other hand, sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the world around her. "Mrs. Jenkins, do you have a version of what might have happened?" Jackson asked, tilting his head slightly. "He fell," she replied. Her voice was even, but there was no conviction in it. "I heard a noise, and when I came down, he was already downstairs." Williams decided to ask a more direct question. Did Michael have any conflicts? Any fights with any of his friends, or with you? Andrea flinched slightly, but answered almost immediately. "No, he was calm. We never fought." The detectives exchanged glances. It was obvious that Andrea was keeping a little too cool for someone who had just lost her stepson. Jackson knew such things always looked unnatural. But for now, it remained only a suspicion, not proof. The next day they met Lauren Maxwell, a longtime family friend who frequented the Jenkins house. Lauren looked excited and immediately started talking. Barely had the detectives had time to introduce themselves. "Look, I don't know what happened here, but I'll tell you one thing. There was something wrong in that house the last few months." Michael looked like something was bothering him. And Andrea, she was acting strange. Too nervous, even aggressive sometimes. Lauren shook her head as if trying to rid herself of a flood of memories. "What do you mean?" Jackson asked. "Well, for one, the few times I heard them talking loudly in the house when Robert wasn't there, it wasn't like normal family conversations. It sounded more like an argument or, I don't know, something else." "Did you ever notice anything more than that? Between the two of them?" Jackson paused deliberately so Lauren could ponder the question. Lauren lowered her eyes and said quietly, "I'm not sure, but it seems like they were a little too close for a stepmother and stepson. I always thought it was just my fantasy, but now I don't know what to think." Those words made the detectives think. They thanked Lauren for her cooperation and headed back to the station to discuss what they had heard. Jackson felt the case was getting more complicated. "If they were really close, that would explain her strange behavior," Williams said as they sat down in the office at the desk. "Yes, but it doesn't explain why he fell down the stairs. Assuming it wasn't an accident, we need a motive for Andrea to do something," Jackson remarked, scratching his chin. "Although a romantic connection is already suspicious in and of itself." The next step was to look into Michael and Andrea's correspondence. Jackson had accessed the phones and computers of both of them. In their messages, detectives found a kind of hidden dialogue, texts filled with ambiguity, as if they were hiding something. Some days they exchanged tender words. Other days they had arguments where the tension was palpable. "Look at this," Williams said, showing Jackson one of the texts. She writes, "You can't just leave me like this." The date of the message is the day before he died. Interesting. It could have been a simple altercation, or it could have been a serious cause for conflict, Jackson thought, staring at the screen. We need to find out what they talked about in person because the correspondence clearly doesn't say everything. They decided to talk to Andrea again to find out if she knew what Michael was going to talk to Robert about the night before he died. The detectives met with her at the police station. She looked tired, but still held herself with dignity. "Mrs. Jenkins, we have reviewed the correspondence between you and Michael. You claimed you had no quarrels, but it seems to us that your relationship was somewhat more complicated than you claim," Jackson began. Andrea looked at him with an expression of a mixture of surprise and fear. "You don't understand," she began. "We were close, but that doesn't mean there were problems between us. He was like my son." And yet the message the day before he died makes you think otherwise. "You can't just leave me like that." It sounds like desperation. "Were you afraid he'd leave you?" Jackson paused, watching her reaction. Andrea looked away and said discreetly, "You don't understand. I was attached to him like a mother. If I wrote anything like that, it was in a burst of emotion." But Jackson saw the fear flash in her eyes. He decided not to push too hard. At this stage, he had no direct evidence to incriminate her, but one thing was certain. She was hiding something important. The investigation was going slowly, but each new fact was adding up to a mosaic. The whole story seemed too strange to be just an accident. Detectives Jackson and Williams returned to the Jenkins house to gather more evidence. The initial inspection did not give them a complete picture, and there was a feeling that something important had been missed. The detectives decided to do a more detailed inspection, including taking fingerprints in the hallway. It was then that Jackson noticed a small, barely discernible camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the camera. "Older model, from back when they were the size of tin cans." Williams stepped closer and took a closer look. "I wonder if it works. Maybe the owners just haven't gotten around to taking it down." When they checked the system, it turned out the camera was still recording, on an old server in Robert's office that everyone seemed to have long forgotten about. The detectives plugged the device into a laptop and began reviewing the recordings. The camera located in the hallway captured part of the stairs and the lower landing, but its view was limited. The top of the stairs remained out of view. The detectives rewound the tape to the time of the incident and saw Michael fall and remain motionless on the floor. A few seconds later, Andrea comes down the stairs, but she clearly did not come from the kitchen as she had said earlier. The camera captures her already standing over Michael's body. "So she was there," Jackson muttered, squinting his eyes. "Her story doesn't add up to what we're seeing." Williams noticed that in the video, Andrea looked extremely tense, as if she was afraid someone would see her. This behavior added to the suspicion. Detectives decided to talk to her again, but this time with specific questions. The next time, Andrea seemed less confident than before. Perhaps she was alerted by the detective's sudden interest in the details. "Mrs. Jenkins, we were able to locate a camera in your hallway. The footage shows you were on the stairs earlier than you said." Jackson, not hiding his skepticism, glared at her. Andrea hesitated for a second, her face going pale. "The camera, didn't know it still worked. It was installed years ago. You said you left the kitchen, but the footage shows you standing over Michael's body. Can you explain why you changed your statement?" Jackson continued to press her. Andrea tried to pull herself together. "Ia was in shock. It all happened so fast, and I didn't immediately realize exactly what had happened. Maybe I just got confused." "There's no mistaking it," Williams remarked. "You'll have to explain why you lied, Mrs. Jenkins." The detectives decided not to show her any more evidence for the time being, but they had other evidence at their disposal to check out. The next step was a detailed examination of the medical report of Michael's injuries. It turned out that there were scratches on his body that matched the fingernail marks. This was another reason to be suspicious of Andrea. Now they had to find out how these scratches could have appeared. Jackson and Williams went to the lab to talk to the medical examiner. "The report says the scratches are fresh, possibly applied minutes before death," the examiner explained as he leafed through the papers. "They are located on the wrists and forearms, as if Michael was trying to free himself from someone's grip." That statement made the detectives think. They knew that if Andrea was indeed on the stairs and the scratches on Michael came from her fingernails, it could indicate a physical conflict. The detectives decided to examine another potentially important piece of evidence: Michael's diary found among his personal belongings. It contained entries about his personal experiences, anxieties, and strained relationship with Andrea. One of the last entries contained the unequivocal words, "I can't go on with this, she's gone too far. I need to leave before it's too late." It sounds like he was going to break up with her, Williams noted. The question is how ready she might have been for that. Considering she lied about where she came from and there are scratches on his body, that already gives us something concrete, Jackson said thoughtfully. But we have to tie all these details together to present a consistent picture. The detectives continued interviewing witnesses, including Robert and Lauren. Robert reiterated again that he had no idea how it all happened, but the detectives noticed that he was becoming more wary. Lauren, on the other hand, mentioned how she'd seen the strange relationship between Andrea and Michael and expressed doubts that they were just stepmother and stepson. "I don't know exactly what went on between them, but I'm sure it wasn't a normal family thing," she said. "Michael was always uncomfortable when Andrea was around." The evidence began to pile up into a mosaic. A camera in the hallway showed that Andrea had been at the scene before she claimed. Scratches on Michael indicated a physical struggle, and entries in his journal hinted at an attempt to break up with her, all of which indicated that there was more going on between them than just a family fight. Now the detectives had a plan. They were going to conduct another interview with Andrea, but this time focusing on her motives and attempts to hide the truth. Detectives Jackson and Williams knew they were close to a clue, but one more link was needed to finally tie everything together. The initial evidence, the camera footage, the scratches on Michael's body, and Andrea's testimony created the big picture, but didn't reveal the whole truth. Everything pointed to an intense conflict, but the detectives needed to find corroboration of motives and uncover what exactly led to the tragedy. They decided to go through Michael's personal effects again. During a search of his room, detectives discovered that his devices were synchronized with a cloud service. This could have been an important clue. The data from the cloud could have contained deleted messages that were not available on the phone when it was seized. The forensic scientist regained access to the cloud archive, and detectives were able to access Michael's old correspondence, which for some reason remained on the cloud server, even though it had been deleted from the phone. They discovered messages that shed light on Michael and Andrea's relationship. A few days before his death, Michael wrote, "I can't go on like this. It's all wrong, and if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to tell my father everything." Andrea's response was even more disturbing. "You're not going to ruin our life. I won't allow it." Her messages clearly showed an obsession and a willingness to go to extreme lengths to keep the secret. With this data in hand, Jackson and Williams realized that they now had everything they needed to pursue the truth from Andrea. They decided to conduct a final interrogation to present her with evidence and force her to tell what really happened that night. Andrea sat in the interrogation room, her hands shaking, though she tried to hide it. This time her calmness seemed unnatural, as if she was forcing herself to hold herself up. "Mrs. Jenkins," Jackson began, his voice firm but not aggressive, "we have new information. We have discovered correspondence that Michael has been saving in the cloud. These messages clearly state that he was going to end your relationship and even threaten to tell your husband everything." Andrea flinched, her face tensing. She knew there was no point in hiding the truth any further, but she tried to justify herself anyway. "You don't understand. He said it in a fit of anger." "And your reports say otherwise," Williams interrupted her. "You're not going to ruin our lives. I won't allow it. You've explicitly stated that you'd do anything to keep him around." Andrea lowered her head, her hands clenched into fists. I just wanted him to stay. I was afraid that if he told Robert, my life would be ruined. Everything I was building would fall apart. But I didn't want it to end like this." Jackson, not missing an opportunity, asked a direct question. "And then when he told you he was going to leave, you pushed him, didn't you?" She lifted her head, her face contorted with pain. "We were arguing. He was saying horrible things, trying to leave. I wanted to hold him back, and when he pushed me away, I pushed him back. It was an accident, I swear. I didn't think it would end like that." Her confession confirmed the detective's version of events. Her obsession with Andrea had driven her to extremes, and a flash of rage led to her pushing Michael. It wasn't a cold-blooded murder, but her actions caused his death. For Jackson and Williams, the case was over. They determined that a secret affair, fear of exposure, and jealousy led to the tragedy. Andrea's confession and the evidence they found came together to complete the story. In the final scene, Robert stood in the courtroom, his face impassive, as if he had fallen into a deep apathy. He had lost his son, and now his wife had been found guilty. Her tears and pleas did not move him. To him, it was only a tragic denouement he could never have imagined. The Jenkins house seemed even emptier than ever. There were no sounds or warmth left in it, only a heavy silence that pressed against the walls. Robert sat in a leather chair by the window, clutching a glass of bourbon in his hand. On the desk in front of him lay Michael's clipboard that the detectives had handed him a few days ago. He hesitated, hesitating to open it, as if another confirmation of what was happening was unbearable to him. Eventually, determination took over. Robert turned on his tablet and began leafing through the correspondence. His fingers trembled slightly when he saw Andrea's name in the contacts. He knew what he would find here, but that didn't make the shock any less painful. Messages appeared on the screen, short lines, exchanges of remarks, then affectionate and tender, then angry and harsh. Robert read how Michael begged Andrea to leave him alone, and she responded with threats. "You will not ruin our life. I won't allow it. The words echoed in his head like an echo that couldn't be drowned out. He flipped through the messages like the pages of an old diary that revealed their secrets he never knew they had. A sense of alienation grew in his chest, as if he were reading a foreign, absurd story that he had nothing to do with. But this was his family, his wife, his son. He took a deep sip, letting the scalding warmth of the alcohol spread through his body. Memories came flooding back, intertwined with a sense of loss. Robert remembered the moments when everything had seemed normal, when he still believed that Andrea was loyal to him, and Michael was his pride and heir. All of that now seemed like some kind of falsity, covered in a thin layer of lies. Michael's last message appeared on the screen. "I can't go on like this, it's all wrong." Robert felt his throat constrict and his eyes water. He blinked rapidly, chasing the tears away. He finished the bourbon and poured himself another. With each sip, the pain became a little less acute, but an emptiness grew inside. His whole life, everything he knew and held dear, had crumbled in an instant. This was the house he'd lived in with his family, but now the place was just a reminder of what he'd lost. And lost forever. Robert looked at the tablet screen again, at the long lines that blurred before his eyes. Then he closed his eyes and took another sip, clutching the glass tightly in his hand.